The Scarlet Letter. Chapter 1. A Terrible Sin. Although the forefathers of the Boston colony strove to create a utopian society, two of the first things they built when they made their town were a cemetery and a prison. On this day, 20 years after the first Puritan settlers arrived in the New World colony, the townspeople gathered outside the prison.
"Good women,"
proclaimed one woman.
"If we judged wicked women like Hester Prynne, she would not have the easy sentence that the town magistrates have handed her."
"Yes,"
agreed another woman.
"they should at least brand the mark upon her forehead with a hot iron. By placing the mark on the front of her gown, she can cover it up any time." "Yes,"
cried another.
"she may cover it as she likes, but the mark will always be on her heart."
Then the prison door, covered in iron spikes, flew open. A large, frightening figure in black came out from the inner darkness. With his hand, he tried to usher out a young woman, but she pushed the hand away and stepped out into the open by her own free will, with an air of dignity. In the woman's arms was a 3-month-old baby. The baby winked because it was the first time it had ever felt sunlight on its face. The mother, standing fully revealed amid the townspeople, lowered the baby in her arm to show her gown. She was blushing, but she wore a proud smile. On the breast of her gown was a large letter A. The letter was made of fine red cloth and embroidered with rich gold thread. The design was artistic and fanciful. Hester Prynne was a tall young woman with an elegant figure and dark gleaming hair. Those who knew her were amazed at her beauty and ladylike comportment under these circumstances.
"She certainly has great skill with the sewing needle,"
remarked one of the women.
"but what a shameful way to show it."
"Make way in the king's name!" shouted the prison officer. "Everyone will have a chance to get a good view of this wicked woman from now until noon. Come along, Hester. Show your scarlet letter in the marketplace." A lane opened up between the spectators, and Hester Prynne walked toward the area appointed for public punishment. Calmly, she came to the scaffold at the western end of the marketplace, next to Boston's oldest church. The scaffold was a platform where punishments were carried out publicly so as to impress the citizenry into obeying the laws. There was a pillory there, designed to hold a human head tightly and keep it in the public gaze. But Hester Prynne was not sentenced to its confinement. Her sentence was just to stand on the platform for 3 hours. She climbed the steps and began her sentence. The onlookers stared at her and the scarlet letter in solemn silence. Hester had prepared herself to face the assault of the public's scorn and insults, but she found their heavy silence almost more difficult to bear. When she stood there, her mind began to travel back into itself as memories began to surface. She could see and feel the days of her happy childhood. Then she saw her face gazing in the mirror and its glow of young beauty. Then she saw the face of a man who was much older. His eyes were dim, and his skin was pale from many years of cloistered study. His figure was slightly misshapen, his left shoulder a bit higher than his right. Then Hester Prynne's memories ended, and she found herself back on the scaffolding, surrounded by the townspeople. They were still staring at her and the scarlet letter on her breast. She looked down at the letter on her chest and touched it to assure herself it was real. And it was, as were the infant and her burning shame. After standing there for a little while, Hester saw a person on the edge of the crowd that she couldn't ignore. He was a white man standing next to a native. The white man, small, with a wrinkled face, was wearing a mix of a civilized and savage costume. Although he had tried to disguise his physical features, it was clear that his left shoulder was higher than his right. As she stared at him, her child cried in pain from the tightness of her grasp on it, but she did not seem to hear. The man, who was a stranger in this town, stared back at Hester Prynne. At first his glance was careless, but as he began to understand the situation she was in, a look of horror came across his face.
I ask you, kind sir,
the man said to a townsman,
who is this woman, and why must she suffer such public shame?
You must be a stranger to this town, answered the townsman. Everyone who lives here knows about Hester Prynne and her wicked ways. She has created a huge scandal among the members of Reverend Dimsdale's church.
That's right,
replied the man.
I am a stranger. I have been a captive of the savage heathens in the south for a long time. Please tell me of this woman Hester Prynne's crime.
This woman is the wife of an English scholar. He decided to join our colony and sent his wife over ahead of him. But this man hasn't been heard from in 2 years, and his young wife was left to her own poor judgment.
Ah, I see what you mean,
said the stranger with a bitter smile.
So who is the father of the baby she's holding?
That fact is the puzzling question that remains for everyone, said the townsman. Mrs. Prynne refuses to name the other sinner.
Her husband should come and solve the mystery,
said the stranger. Yes, he should if he's still alive, agreed the townsman. The penalty for this crime is normally death, but the magistrates were merciful because her husband is probably at the bottom of the sea. But afterward she will bear the scarlet mark of an adulterer for the rest of her life.
It is a wise punishment,
said the stranger.
Her mark will serve as a living sermon against sin, but it angers me that her fellow sinner is not standing there next to her. But he will be discovered and known. He will.
As the stranger walked away, Hester Prynne kept her eyes on him. She was relieved to be in the presence of the crowd so as not to meet the man alone. Suddenly, she was awoken from her thoughts by a voice.
Hester Prynne, you must now listen to me.
Standing on the balcony of the nearby church, used by magistrates to pronounce sentences, was Governor Bellingham. There were other noblemen on the balcony with the governor and his men. Hester Prynne faced the balcony. The voice she had heard belonged to Boston's oldest minister, Pastor John Wilson.
Hester Prynne,
continued the old pastor,
I have told your minister here, the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale, that he should force you to tell us the name of the wicked man who had tempted you to this sad fall here and now.
Then Governor Bellingham spoke.
Good Reverend Dimsdale, as her minister, you are responsible for this woman's soul. You must urge her to speak and therefore prove her repentance.
To respond, Reverend Dimsdale rose to address the crowd. The Reverend was a young clergyman who had graduated from one of the great English universities. His powerful voice and impressive intellect had already brought him great respect and admiration from the colonists he served.
Speak to the woman, brother,
urged Pastor Wilson.
You are the only one who can save her soul.
Reverend Dimsdale looked to the woman on the scaffolding.
Hester Prynne, he began, you've heard what the good Pastor Wilson has said. I urge you to speak the name of your fellow sinner. It will give both of your hearts peace. Do not remain silent out of misplaced pity or tenderness for him.
Even the baby in Hester Prynne's arms was affected by the Reverend's powerful voice. It looked up at him with a half-happy, half-sad expression on its face. But to this entreaty, Hester just shook her head.
Woman, do not test the limits of heaven's mercy,
said Pastor Wilson with an angry voice.
Speak the name, and your repentance will be enough to take the scarlet letter off your breast.
Never,
shouted Hester Prynne. She looked deeply into Reverend Dimsdale's eyes.
This letter is branded too deeply on my heart to remove it so easily. I hope to endure his agony as well as my own.
Speak!
cried the townspeople around the scaffolding. Speak the name of your baby's father! She went pale as she seemed to recognize one of the stern, cold voices coming from the crowd. But she insisted.
I will not speak. My baby will never have an earthly father. She will have to know the heavenly one.
She won't confess his name, whispered Dimsdale as he leaned over the balcony with his hand over his heart.
"She will not speak," he announced to the crowd.
Once Hester had returned to the prison, she was in a state of nervous hysteria, and the baby kept crying wildly. Master Brackett, the jailer, kept a constant watch on her to make sure she did not hurt herself or her baby. Finally, he brought in a doctor to see her. The doctor was the same stranger who had taken an interest in her while she had been on the scaffolding. His name was Roger Chillingworth. As the jailer led him into the room and Hester Prynne saw him, she became as still as death.
"Don't worry,"
the doctor told the jailer.
"I'll take great care of Mrs. Prynne and her child. You will soon have peace and quiet in your prison."
The doctor mixed up an herbal remedy from local plants that he had learned from the natives.
"Here, Mrs. Prynne, give this to your baby. She'll only accept it from your hands, and it will calm her."
Hester pushed his hand away.
Would you avenge yourself by poisoning this innocent baby?
She whispered.
"Woman, don't be foolish,"
the doctor responded in a cold yet soothing manner.
"I would not harm this poor, misbegotten baby."
Hesitantly, she gave the drink to her infant, and it dropped peacefully off to sleep. Then the doctor offered Hester some medicine for herself. Looking warily into the cup, she said,
And how do I know you wouldn't kill me with poison for revenge?
"Hester,"
responded the doctor,
"do you know me so little that you think my purposes could be so shallow? Would not letting you live with this burning shame on your breast be the best revenge of all?"
At this, she smiled a little and took her medicine. The doctor continued speaking while her medicine took effect.
"You know, I should have guessed this would have happened. I could have seen that scarlet letter blazing at the end of the church aisle we walked down on the day we got married."
You know,
she said to him.
I was always honest with you. I always told you I felt no love for you, nor would I ever pretend to. But I am sorry. I have greatly wronged you.
"No,"
he answered.
"we have wronged each other. I should not have trapped your blossoming youth into this unnatural bond with my decay. The scales between us are balanced. But I will seek revenge against the cowardly man who has left you to suffer this shame alone. You might not tell me his name, but I will discover it. I will. Now all I ask you is that you keep my identity as your husband a secret in this town, and do not tell the man upon whom I'll seek revenge about me."
I will keep your secret as I have his,
said Hester. Chapter 2. Hester's Pearl. The imprisonment of Hester Prynne ended shortly after her discussion with the doctor, but the torment of her life among the townspeople was just beginning. She was free to leave the town, but Hester had decided to stay and face her lifelong sentence. She and her baby moved into a small cottage on the outskirts of town. She was able to make a decent living with her expert sewing skills, but she spent very little of her income on herself. She dressed her young daughter very well and gave her extra money to charity. Because of her exceptional skill, the townspeople always hired Hester to do work, but they never allowed her to forget her shame with their looks and words. Hester's daughter, Pearl, had been named not for a pearl's great beauty or value, but rather for its great price. Nevertheless, the baby soon blossomed into a beautiful but strange child. When Hester watched her daughter and perceived the young girl's strange behavior, she worried that the child was somehow also connected and influenced by the Scarlet Letter. As Pearl got older, it became clear that the child could not be forced to adapt to rules. She would not heed the simplest of her mother's commands, and her temper was uneven. It was as if the warfare of Hester's spirit were carrying on in Pearl. Hester would have liked to see her playing with other children, but Pearl was as much an outcast as her mother, and she accepted her position from the time when she was very young. Fate had built an unbreakable wall around Pearl. When she did meet some of the town's vicious Puritan children who gathered around her, she would become terrible, flinging stones at them and screaming like a small savage. The sight of her combative daughter brought Hester to her knees, asking,
Dear Heavenly Father, What kind of being is this that I brought into the world?
And when little Pearl heard her mother cry like this, she would merely look at her and smile with her elf-like intelligence. One of the strangest things about Pearl was that, as a baby, her first interest had not been her mother's smile, as it is with most infants. Rather, her first attraction was to the scarlet A on her mother's bosom. Some years later, Pearl was running around. One day she gathered a bundle of wildflowers. She then began pitching them at the letter on her mother's breast and dancing up and down with joy when one of them hit the scarlet letter. Hester's first instinct was to cover the letter with her arms, but she resisted, considering each flower's painful strike against her heart to be part of her penance. To her mother's obvious pain, Pearl only laughed, her eyes flashing with a demonic glow.
Are you really my child?
Hester asked her playfully.
Who made you, and who sent you here?
You tell me.
Replied Pearl, who became very serious.
Do tell me.
The Heavenly Father sent you.
Hester answered after a pause. But her hesitation was not lost on the child's keen intelligence.
He did not send me.
Cried Pearl.
I have no Heavenly Father.
Oh, please.
Cried Hester.
You mustn't say that. He created all of us.
No, you must tell me.
Laughed Pearl, who danced about.
Do tell me.
Hester shuddered, unable to answer her question. One day, Hester brought Pearl with her to Governor Bellingham's mansion. She told Pearl they were going to return a pair of gloves he had asked her to embroider, but the real reason was that Hester had heard rumors that the townspeople were planning to take her daughter away from her. They suspected Pearl might be a demon child, so by taking her away, they planned to save Hester's soul. Hester had also heard that Governor Bellingham was at the head of this plan, so she made up her mind to speak with him. That day, she had dressed Pearl in a bright red dress that was embroidered with gold thread, just like her scarlet A, so that the child seemed to be a living extension of it. When they reached the luxurious mansion, Pearl saw a blossoming rose bush and demanded that her mother pick one of the red flowers for her. When Hester refused, Pearl burst into a fit of tears and let out an ear-piercing scream. But she then suddenly became silent when she saw some people approaching them. In the group were Governor Bellingham, Pastor Wilson, the young Reverend Arthur Dimsdale, and Dr. Roger Chillingworth. Reverend Dimsdale's health had been suffering as of late, and the doctor, who was treating him, had become his close and constant companion. Looking with surprise at the little girl dressed in stunning scarlet, the governor asked,
"Who is this little one here?"
Ah, this is the daughter of the unfortunate Hester Prynne,
Pastor Wilson said.
She is the one we've spoken about recently.
"Yes," said Governor Bellingham. "We shall look into this matter right here and now. Hester Prynne," he said, looking directly at the letter on her breast, "we have greatly discussed as to whether it is our duty to protect the eternal souls of you and your child. Don't you think it would be best for this child to be taken and clothed plainly and disciplined in the truths of heaven and earth?"
I can teach my daughter better than anyone else,
said Hester Prynne, putting her finger on her letter.
I have learned from this.
"Woman," said the governor, "that is your badge of shame, and the reason we think it best to put the child in more righteous hands."
Nevertheless,
Hester Prynne said calmly,
it has taught me lessons which will make my daughter wiser and better.
"We will be the judges of that,"
said Bellingham. Then he sat down in a chair and tried to put Pearl between his knees, but the child, unaccustomed to the touch of anyone but her mother, escaped. Pastor Wilson, who was known to be good with children, continued the examination.
Pearl, can you tell me who made you?
Hester Prynne had educated her child at home in the matters of Puritan beliefs about the creation of the human spirit. But Pearl decided to answer the serious question mischievously. She then announced that she had not been made in heaven, but rather she had been plucked from the wild rose bush that grew by the prison door.
"This is terrible,"
the governor cried.
Here is a 3-year-old child who can't tell who made her.
Hester Prynne grabbed Pearl into her arms.
God gave me this child in return for all the things he has taken from me. She is my happiness and my torture. I will die before you take her from me.
Child,
said old Pastor Wilson.
Pearl will be cared for better than you can do.
God gave her to me for safekeeping,
screamed Hester Prynne. Then she turned to the young Reverend Dimmesdale and cried,
You speak for me. You are my pastor and in charge of my soul. You know me better than these men can. Don't let them take her away from me.
There is truth in her words, Reverend Dimmesdale said in his powerful, trembling voice. God gave this child to this mother to teach her to change her wicked ways. That bond is sacred. Who are we to say that God made a mistake in giving the child to her? Who are we to take away the good Lord's one blessing in her life?
Well spoken,
said Pastor Wilson.
What do you say, Governor Bellingham? The good Reverend has pleaded convincingly on Hester Prynne's behalf.
Indeed he has, answered the governor. Pearl shall stay with her mother, and we will make no further scandal of the matter. At the proper time, the church's officers will make sure that she goes to school and church. That's all.
Then young Pearl grabbed Reverend Dimmesdale's hand and put it on her cheek. The minister looked around and then kissed her forehead.
A strange child,
said Dr. Chillingworth.
Perhaps if we study her nature, we'll be able to guess the identity of her sinful father.
It would be sinful to do that,
answered Pastor Wilson.
It would be better to pray on the matter and leave it to God's will.
After the matter was settled, Hester Prynne and Pearl left the governor's mansion. Outside the house, they met Mistress Hibbins, Governor Bellingham's bitter sister, who was executed a few years later for practicing witchcraft.
Psst, psst.
She hissed.
Will you two come with us to the forest tonight to hold congregation with the black man?
We will not,
answered Hester Prynne.
I will stay at home with my daughter. But if they had taken her from me, I would have come with you and signed my name in the evil black man's book in my own blood.
After this, it could be said that even this early, the child had saved Hester Prynne's soul from Satan's trap. Chapter 3. Revenge. It was around the time that Roger Chillingworth settled in the town as a doctor that the young Reverend Dimmesdale's health began to decline. The townspeople saw the coincidence of the ailing Reverend and the doctor's arrival as a miracle enacted by the providence of God. Therefore, the town elders thought it was God's will that Reverend Dimmesdale's health be placed in Dr. Chillingworth's hands. The two men soon became constant companions. Reverend Dimmesdale was fascinated by Chillingworth's wealth of experience as a doctor and an older man, while the doctor spent his time looking for clues to the Reverend's illness. Chillingworth was convinced that his bodily sickness was the result of a troubled heart and mind. Yet the doctor was unable to figure out just what was troubling the Reverend's mind. The two men soon moved into a house together. But as time passed, the townspeople began to see Dr. Chillingworth differently. His appearance and demeanor had changed remarkably since moving to the town. Where he was once calm and kind, they now saw evil on his face. Rumors around town said that the Reverend's poor health was caused by Satan, who haunted him in the form of Roger Chillingworth. It happened one day that the Reverend visited Chillingworth in his laboratory, where he often made drugs from plants he had collected. The doctor was examining a bundle of ugly-looking plants from the graveyard that stood next to their house.
I found these leaves in that graveyard right there,
said the doctor, pointing out the window.
This variety is new to me. I found them growing out of an unmarked grave. I suspect they grew out of the man's heart. Perhaps they represent a dreadful secret that he was buried with. It would have been better that he confessed it during his lifetime.
Maybe he wanted to, but was unable, said the Reverend, gripping his breast as if it were throbbing with pain. When the members of my church confess their sins, they are always greatly relieved. Just then the doctor and the Reverend saw Hester Prynne and Pearl walking over a footpath that ran through the graveyard. Pearl was disrespectfully skipping along from the top of one tomb to the next. Then she gathered a handful of prickly burrs from a burdock plant and stuck them along the lines of her mother's scarlet A.
Ah, that child has no respect for law or authority,
said Roger Chillingworth.
Just the other day I saw her splash water from a horse trough on the governor. What in heaven's name is wrong with her?
Suddenly, Pearl ran up to the window and threw one of the prickly burrs at Reverend Dimmesdale. Then she laughed and called to her mother.
Let's go, Mother, or the black man is going to get you like he has already gotten the Reverend. Come quickly, or he'll catch you. But he can't catch me.
Do you think Hester Prynne is less miserable for bearing her shame in that letter on her breast rather than hiding it away in her heart?
The doctor asked the Reverend as the mother and her child walked away from the window. Yes, I believe so, answered the Reverend. But what I really want to talk about right now is my health. What is your judgment as to the cause of my chronic ailment?
Frankly speaking,
said the doctor,
I want to know if you have any secrets you're failing to tell me. Have you told me everything about your problems?
This probing line of questioning visibly flustered the Reverend. But, of course I have, he stammered. Of course there are parts of my soul I could never expose to an earthly doctor.
But how can I cure your body if you have not laid open your mind and soul?
At this, the Reverend suddenly became fiercely angry and shoved the doctor's hands away from him. With a frantic gesture, he stormed out of the room. Within a couple of hours, the Reverend returned to the doctor's laboratory and apologized for his outburst. The two resumed their friendship effortlessly. But later that day, while the Reverend slept in his chair, the doctor crept silently into his room. Putting his hand on the sleeping man's chest, the doctor pushed back the Reverend's shirt and looked at his bare chest. The doctor shuddered for a moment at what he saw. Then a devilish look of happiness and satisfaction crept across his face. After this day, the relationship between Roger Chillingworth and Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale changed subtly. The doctor maintained his calm appearance, but secretly he was controlling the Reverend and planning to take revenge on him. Dimmesdale often punished himself secretly for the crime he had committed. He would force himself to go without food and sleep, and would even whip himself until he was bloody. Then one night, he thought of a new method for self-punishment. In the middle of the night, he got dressed and quietly left the house. As if he were walking through a dream, the Reverend went to the western end of the marketplace, to the scaffolding where Hester Prynne had stood 7 years earlier. On that dark May night, the Reverend climbed the steps of the scaffolding and stood on the platform atop it. He felt that the town was asleep and that there was no danger of anyone discovering him. But while he stood there, his mind was overcome with horror, and he felt the scarlet letter burning from within his breast. It was the source of his pain and illness. Then suddenly, he released a shriek so long and loud that he expected the whole town to awake and come running to see him in his place of shame. But the drowsy townspeople must have thought his voice was merely the cries of wild animals or the cackles of witches, because nobody came running. Then the Reverend perceived a light approaching from the distance. When it got close enough for him to recognize the bearer, the Reverend saw that it was Pastor Wilson. The pastor did not notice the Reverend and kept walking past. The Reverend knew that the pastor was coming from a late-night vigil in the death chamber of Governor Winthrop, who had probably just passed away. After the pastor passed, another light approached. This time the Reverend could see that it was Hester Prynne and Pearl. "Hester Prynne," said the Reverend, "is that you?"
Reverend Dimmesdale!
exclaimed Hester, who was taken by surprise to find him standing atop the scaffolding in the dark.
Yes, it is Pearl and I. We are coming from Governor Winthrop's death chamber, where I measured him for a robe. We're on the way back to our cottage.
"Hester, Pearl, come up here," said the Reverend. "You have both been up here before, but I was not with you." Silently, Hester held Pearl's hand, and they climbed up the steps of the platform. In the darkness, the Reverend found Pearl's hand and held it. A fresh force of life poured into his heart, and the blood rushed through his veins. The weight was lifted from his soul.
Reverend,
Said little Pearl.
will you stand here tomorrow at noon with me and my mother?
No, not tomorrow, said the Reverend, but I shall one day,
But when?
asked Pearl. I shall stand with you and your mother before the Lord on Judgment Day, he answered. Pearl laughed at this, and suddenly a meteor flashed and lit up the night sky. There in its luminescence stood Hester with her scarlet A, the Reverend holding his hand over his heart, and Pearl holding both their hands. When he returned his eyes to earth, the Reverend saw Pearl pointing toward a person coming closer from the distance. As the person came closer, they saw that it was Roger Chillingworth. Hester, who is that man? Asked the Reverend. I've become frightened of him. I've started to hate him,
I can tell you who he is.
said Pearl. Then she put her lips to the Reverend's ear and whispered nonsense, and then she laughed out loud. Child, are you mocking me? Asked the Reverend,
You are not true.
said the little girl.
You won't stand here with me and mother tomorrow at noon.
Good sir,
said Roger Chillingworth, who had come up to the scaffolding.
whatever are you doing out here at this time of night? Have you been sleepwalking?
How did you know I was here? Asked the Reverend fearfully.
I had no idea you were here. I was just walking home from the governor's death chamber. You'd better come home with me now, or you'll not have enough energy to give your sermon tomorrow.
Yes, said the Reverend. I'll go home with you. The man suddenly felt cold and depressed, as if rudely awakened from a dream. After the night on the scaffolding, Hester Prynne became worried that the Reverend was losing his mind. She remembered her agreement with Roger Chillingworth some years earlier, that she would hide his true identity as her husband. But now she felt it was her fault for not warning the Reverend of Chillingworth's terrible intentions. She resolved that she would speak with Chillingworth and tell him that she could no longer keep that promise. She had to tell the Reverend who his tormentor really was. Hester did not have to wait long to speak with the doctor. She saw him in the forest, gathering plants one afternoon a few days later.
Run along and play.
She said to Pearl.
I want to speak with the doctor.
Then she turned to Chillingworth and said,
Doctor, I need to speak with you about an important matter.
Ah, Mistress Hester,
he said with a smile.
I hear the town council may soon allow you to take that scarlet letter off your bosom.
If I were worthy to be done with it, it would fall off by itself.
She replied, noticing that the past 7 years had transformed Chillingworth into a creature that resembled a devil. She knew that his life of seeking revenge must have been transforming his mind, body, and soul into such a dark form.
What do you see in my face that makes you look at it so seriously?
Asked the doctor.
Something that makes me want to weep.
She answered.
But let us speak of another miserable man. 7 years ago, I promised to keep your identity a secret. But I have a duty to help this man who you are slowly killing. I must tell him who you are so that he may understand why you are tormenting him.
That cowardly priest is conscious of my influence and my curse,
said Chillingworth.
He's just too afraid to admit it to himself. You are foolish to want to help such a low wretch as him who abandoned you with child to the mercy of this town for all these years.
I must help him,
cried Hester.
This scarlet letter instructs me to do so. I will keep your secret no longer.
Go ahead and tell him,
said Chillingworth.
I pity you for wasting your goodness on that weak shamble of a man.
I pity you too,
Hester answered.
I pity you for suffering such hatred that it has changed a wise man into a demon.
Hester found Pearl down by the stream where she had been playing. The little girl had arranged a green A, just like her mother's, on the bosom of her dress.
Ah, my Pearl, But your green A does not have the same meaning as the one I'm doomed to wear. Do you know why I wear this letter?
I do.
answered Pearl.
For the same reason that the Reverend holds his hand over his heart.
Chapter 4. The Forest. Hester remained strong in her resolve to tell the Reverend just who Roger Chillingworth really was. On a day Hester knew that the Reverend would be passing through the forest, she set out to cross his path, taking along little Pearl. As they entered the forest, Pearl cried out,
Mother, the sunshine doesn't love you. It runs away and hides because of the A on your bosom.
Then you had better run away and try to catch it,
answered her mother. The little girl actually did catch the sun, standing amid its brilliant splendor. As they passed deeper into the forest, Pearl asked her mother to sit and rest for a while.
Tell me a story.
She demanded.
A story about what?
Asked Hester.
A story about the black man who haunts the forest with his big, heavy black book with iron clasps. And tell me about how he makes people write their names in his book using their own blood. Did you ever meet the black man, Mother?
Who told you about this?
Hester asked.
Last night, when we were at the house you were watching, the old woman thought I was asleep while she spoke of it. She said that the scarlet letter was the black man's mark on you.
I'll tell you a story about the black man if you won't ask me any more afterward,
said Hester.
I met the black man once, and this scarlet letter is his mark.
Suddenly, Hester heard footsteps coming through the forest.
Pearl, run along now and play. I want to speak with the man who's coming toward us.
Is it the black man?
Inquired Pearl.
Of course not, silly child. It is the Reverend.
It is,
said Pearl, who could now see the Reverend coming through the darkened forest.
And he has his hand over his heart. That's because he wrote his name in the book, and the black man put his mark over the Reverend's heart. But why doesn't he wear it on the outside like you?
Now go, child,
cried Hester.
Stay near the stream and don't go too far.
Pearl walked away, singing to herself. Hester saw the Reverend coming down the path. He looked weaker and more depressed than ever.
Arthur Dimmesdale!
She called out to him.
Reverend Dimmesdale!
Who speaks? Answered the Reverend nervously. Hester, is that you?
Yes, it is I,
she answered. They had not been alone together in over 7 years because of their situation. They were both nervous and happy to see one another. Fixing his eyes on her, he asked, Hester, have you found peace? She smiled drearily and looked down at the symbol on her bosom.
Have you?
No, I have found nothing but darkness and despair. I preach purity to my followers, but I know the emptiness and agony of what I truly am. I feel like Satan is always laughing at me.
You are wrong to torture yourself like this,
said Hester.
You have repented deeply for years now. You must learn to leave your sin in the past.
No, Hester, cried the Reverend. I'm not worthy to wear these holy garments that clothe me. You are lucky to wear the A on your chest. My mark burns within me. If only I had one friend to whom I could tell the truth of my sins.
I am that friend and your partner in sin,
said Hester. Then she struggled to give the Reverend the message that was the reason for their meeting on this day.
You also have a great enemy who lives under the same roof as you.
An enemy under my roof? The Reverend said with surprise. What do you mean?
Oh, Arthur,
cried Hester.
Please forgive me. A long time ago, I agreed to deceive you. The old man, the doctor whom they call Roger Chillingworth, he was my husband.
A look of terrible violence came over the Reverend's face. He sank down to the ground and buried his face in his hands. I should have known it, groaned the Reverend. My heart told me he was hiding a terrible secret from the day I first met him. Why did I not understand? Oh, Hester Prynne, you are responsible for this. I can never forgive you, he shouted.
Hester Prynne threw her arms around the Reverend and held him close to her. His cheek rested on the scarlet letter. He tried to struggle free, but she would not let him go.
You must forgive me.
She said over and over.
You must forgive me.
Yes, cried the Reverend softly. I forgive you now. We are not the worst sinners in the world. That old man's revenge is blacker than my sin. He is killing me in cold blood. What we did was not so bad as that.
No, what we did had a sacredness of its own. We told that to each other when we made love.
She whispered.
Have you forgotten?
No, he whispered. I have not forgotten. This was the gloomiest hour of their lives, but in the darkness of it, there was a charm that made them linger together. There they sat amid the dark forest, holding hands and kissing. Roger Chillingworth knows that you will reveal his identity, said the Reverend. Now he will point his finger at me in front of the whole town.
No, I don't think he'll reveal your sin to the public,
she said.
He will find other secret ways to satisfy his dark passion for revenge. You must get away from this terrible man.
Yes, he's killing me, cried the Reverend hysterically. But what can I do, Hester? Help me, please.
The sea brought you to this new world, and it can carry you back to the old one. You should go back to England, or you could live in Germany, France, or even in Italy.
But how could I leave my post here? Even though my soul is ruined, I'm needed to help others.
You can't help anybody if you're crushed under the weight of your misery. You must leave this place behind,
she said.
The future could be filled with new chances for success. Do anything except lay down and die.
Oh, Hester, cried the Reverend, I must die here. I don't have the strength or courage to risk going back into the strange, cold world alone.
Then in a deep whisper, Hester replied,
You will not go alone.
At this, Arthur Dimmesdale looked into her eyes with joy and hope.
We won't look back,
said Hester.
The past is gone. See?
Then with her fingers she unhooked the scarlet letter from her breast and flung it away from her onto a rock at the edge of the stream. The letter lay there, glittering like a lost jewel. Hester heaved a huge sigh of relief as the burden of shame and anguish left her heart. The freedom she felt made her realize what a weight it had truly been. Hester undid her cap and let her dark, beautiful hair fall down around her shoulders. Then the sunlight came through the tops of the trees and flooded the forest. Hester looked again at the Reverend with eyes full of joy and said,
Now you must get to know our little Pearl. You have seen her, but you do not really know her yet. She is a strange child, but you will learn to love her dearly.
Do you think she will want to know me? Asked the Reverend hopefully. I have always been afraid of little Pearl.
Ah, that is so sad,
answered Hester.
She will love you dearly. She is not far off now. I will call her. Pearl! Pearl!
Pearl was away, gathering up flowers for her mother. She heard the call and came back toward them slowly.
Come here,
said Hester.
I want you to become a dear friend of the Reverend.
But Pearl did not obey her mother's command. The child only pointed to her mother's breast, devoid of the scarlet letter, and stamped her foot.
I see,
said Hester.
Small children don't like to see the things they've always known change even slightly. She is missing the letter that she's seen on me since the day she was born.
Hester pointed to the letter at the edge of the stream and said,
There's the letter, Pearl. Bring it to me now.
You pick it up yourself,
replied Pearl. Frustrated with the child, Hester sighed and walked to the side of the stream and hooked the letter back on her breast.
Do you know your mother now, child?
She said to her daughter.
Yes, now you are my mother indeed,
said little Pearl, bounding across the stream to join them.
Come and see him, Pearl. He wants to greet you. He loves you. Will you love him too?
asked Hester.
Does he really love us?
Pearl asked, looking at her mother in the eyes with sharp intelligence.
Will he walk hand in hand with us into town?
Not now, child,
answered Hester.
but soon he will be with us all the time.
And will he always keep his hand over his heart?
Pearl inquired. Dimsdale, embarrassed by the child's questions, stooped over and kissed her forehead, hoping to soften her view of him. But as soon as his lips left her forehead, she ran to the stream and washed the kiss off her brow, as if it were something dirty. Then she stayed apart from her mother and the Reverend while they discussed their plans to be together in the near future. Chapter 5. The Revelation. After leaving the forest, the Reverend could not believe their meeting had been real. They had decided that the cities of Europe would be the best place for them to begin their new lives. And it happened that there was a ship in Boston Harbor set to leave for the Old World in 4 days. Through Hester's charity work, she knew the ship's captain and was able to make arrangements that she, the Reverend, and Pearl would depart with the ship. When Hester told the Reverend of her arrangement, he was overjoyed and remarked, "How fortunate, as I'm set to give the election sermon in only 3 days' time." The election sermon, to commemorate the swearing-in of the new governor, was the high point in the career of any New England clergyman. Dimsdale returned from his talk with Hester possessing a sense of great physical energy that was very unusual for him. He found that no matter what he did, he could not become tired. Finally, the Reverend entered the peace and solitude of his study, where he could write his most important election sermon. While he was occupied with this task, there came a knock on the door. When the Reverend said, "Come in," he feared he would behold an evil spirit, and he did. It was Roger Chillingworth. The Reverend remained speechless.
"Hello, Reverend,"
said Chillingworth.
"I suspect you will need my medical assistance to help you put your heart and strength into the task of making the election sermon."
"Not this time," answered the Reverend solemnly. "My recent walk through the woods has provided me with a renewal of spirit and energy. I will not need any of your drugs." They both knew that they were no longer trusted friends, but rather bitter enemies.
"Reverend, are you sure you shouldn't use my services to help you make this most important sermon? Heaven knows you may not be here next year to make another one."
"Yes, heaven grant it, I'll be in a better world," replied the Reverend. "But in my present frame of body, I don't need your medicine."
"Well, I'm glad to hear it,"
said the doctor. After the doctor left, the Reverend called his servant to bring him a large meal. He devoured the food like an animal that had not eaten for a long time. Then he spent all night flinging written pages of his sermon from the desk, as if heaven was transmitting the words through his hand. When the Reverend awoke in the morning, the pen was still between his fingers, and the sermon was marvelously completed. On the day of the new governor's inauguration, the marketplace was crowded with the townspeople, who were waiting to see the procession of officials pass and to hear the Reverend's sermon. Hester and Pearl joined the crowd. Everywhere around them were festivities, wrestling matches, and contests. The strict Puritan society was filled with people who were as joyful as they were allowed to be. When Pearl asked if the Reverend would be there, Hester said,
Yes, but he won't be joining us, and we shouldn't speak to him if we see him today.
Roger Chillingworth also came to the festival. When Hester first spotted him, he was speaking with the captain of the ship that would be leaving for Europe on the following day. When Hester later spoke to the captain, he told her that Chillingworth would be joining them on the voyage. Her heart sank at the fearful news, and when she saw Chillingworth, she felt his smile hid a terrible secret meaning. But Hester had no time to think about the captain's shocking news. The time was at hand for the Reverend to give his sermon. When she saw the Reverend Dimsdale, she felt as though he were another person whom she had never seen before. She felt sad, as if he were in another world. Then Hester saw Mistress Hibbins, who asked her if she had met the Reverend in the forest recently. Hester denied it, but Mistress Hibbins continued to tell her that the Reverend had been there and signed his name in the black man's book. She said the black man had his way of leaving a mark on those who would not admit they had signed his book. To make matters worse for Hester Prynne, the festival had brought to town many people from outlying areas. These people encircled her, staring and pointing at her mark of shame. On this day, Hester felt more pain than she had on the first day she had worn the letter. What nobody knew was that the same mark of disgrace burned on the saintly Reverend Dimmesdale. It was at this time that the Reverend's powerful and eloquent voice could be heard throughout the marketplace, coming from a high pedestal at the eastern end of the marketplace. People were brought to silence by his profound words. Many people said that never before had they heard so wise, so high, and so holy a spirit speak as they heard on that day. Through his powerful waves of heaven-inspired words, the Reverend reached his proudest peak of glory as he stood atop the pedestal. Meanwhile, Hester and Pearl stood next to the old scaffolding with the symbol still burning on her breast. When the Reverend's sermon was finished, music began, and a procession of honorable town fathers began walking on a pathway through the crowds of people. When they reached the western end of the marketplace, the people cheered. As the shouts died down, Hester saw the Reverend and was shocked at how very pale and weak he looked. It was as if he had used the last of his energy to deliver his powerful and grand sermon. Now he appeared to be a feeble man who could barely stand by himself. Pastor Wilson hurried to the Reverend's side and tried to hold his arm for fear that he would fall, but the Reverend shook him off. He kept walking on his own, like a shaky infant. By this time, he was very near the old scaffold. The crowd looked at him in shock, wondering if his earthly faintness was just another sign of his heavenly strength. Suddenly, the Reverend turned toward the scaffold and held out his arms. "Hester," he cried, "my little Pearl, come here to me." The look on his face was one of terrible pain. But Pearl ran to him and threw her arms around him. Hester, as if forced by invisible hands, slowly approached him. Together, with Hester supporting the Reverend's weight and Pearl holding his hand, they climbed up the steps of the scaffolding together.
"Are you mad?"
whispered Roger Chillingworth, who stood near them.
"Stand away from that woman and child. You will blacken your good name and be cast into the pit of dishonor. I can't help you after this."
"Ha ha!" The Reverend laughed at Chillingworth. "Tempter, you are too late this time. With God's help, I will escape you now." The crowd watched in an uproar as the three stood on the scaffolding. The noble men of rank and dignity could not understand the meaning of his actions. Old Chillingworth followed them, as if he were just another actor in their guilty drama, on stage for the final act. Looking darkly at the Reverend, he said,
"You could have searched the earth for a place to hide from me. There is no place high or low where you could have escaped to, except for this very scaffolding."
The Reverend looked to Hester. "Isn't this better than the plans we made in the forest?"
I don't know. It may lead to the death of us all.
She replied, "God will protect you and Pearl. As for me, I am a dying man. This is my last chance to accept the truth of my shame." Then the Reverend faced the other clergymen, the governor, the noblemen, and the crowd of townspeople. "People of New England," he cried in a solemn and majestic voice, "behold me, a shameful sinner. I should have stood here 7 years ago when the governor demanded to know the name of Hester Prynne's partner in sin. You have all seen the scarlet letter that this woman wears, but there has stood one among you whose brand of shame and infamy you have not seen." At this point, the Reverend's weakness was so great that he nearly collapsed. But he managed to stand by himself and stepped forward, away from Hester and Pearl. "But now you must witness the great power of the Lord and the true mark of shame. Behold!" With a quick motion, the Reverend tore away his holy robe to expose his bare chest. The crowd was horror-stricken as they gazed upon the terrible miracle emblazoned upon the flesh of his breast. The Reverend had a look of victory on his face shortly before he collapsed to the floor of the scaffold. Hester raised his head in her hands. and old Chillingworth knelt down by him and said,
You have escaped me! You have escaped me!
My little Pearl, the Reverend said to the child beside him, will you kiss me now? The girl leaned forward and kissed his lips, and with her kiss, the spell of grief that had been over her all her life was broken. Her tears fell on her father's cheek. Farewell, Hester, said the Reverend.
Shall we not meet again in heaven? Shall we not spend our eternal lives together? Certainly we've paid enough of a price for that,
she said to him. Only merciful God knows, said the Reverend. If he had not brought me here to tell the truth to these people, I would have been lost forever. Praise to his name. His will is done. Farewell. With that word came the Reverend's last breath. The crowd was silently still, in a state of shock and awe. As the days passed, many people spoke of the Scarlet Letter, just like Hester's, that they had seen imprinted on the Reverend's breast. Some thought he had inflicted it upon himself through terrible self-torture. Others thought that Roger Chillingworth had used drugs and magic spells to inflict it upon him. And still others believed that heaven had placed it there to punish him for his sin. Many of the religious authorities defended Reverend Dimmesdale's character and pronounced that his dying words declared no guilt in the matter of Hester Prynne and her daughter. They said that the Reverend had merely used his last earthly moments to deliver a powerful sermon through his own example. But the moral that stood out from the poor Reverend's miserable experience was ultimately, be true, be true, be true. After the object of Roger Chillingworth's quest for revenge was gone, the old man simply withered away into nothing. He died within the same year and left a great amount of money and property to Hester Prynne's little daughter Pearl. Pearl and Hester disappeared for some time after that, but eventually Pearl became the richest heiress in the New World, and Hester Prynne returned to her little cottage to continue her simple existence of hard work and charity. When she finally died at a very old age, she was buried next to an unmarked grave, which along with hers shared a single blank tombstone. Some years later, there mysteriously appeared a shield engraved on the tombstone. If one were to read it, they would see the inscription, on a black background, the letter A in red.